Today is June 10th, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And with me is Tony Hilliard, who is also a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center. And we're honored to have with us today Jim Torbert. Jim is a Vietnam veteran who has agreed to come in and tell us about his experiences in Vietnam while he served in the U.S. Army. And this is part of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. And Jim, I just want to tell you how honored we are to have you come in here and tell us your story, and thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Would you give us your full name and current address, please?
Full name is James Robert Torbert in Johns Creek, Georgia.
And where and when were you born?
I was born February 16th, 1944 in St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Okay. The family actually lived in a place called Brentwood, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. And I was the middle child of 3 children. I have an older sister and a younger brother. And basically spent all of my growing up years in Brentwood. Brentwood was a small community, St. Louis County, so it was really hard to tell. You couldn't tell if you left St. Louis to go to Brentwood. It was just like driving through any metropolitan area. My family was very active in church. We belonged to a very large Baptist church in downtown St. Louis. And the minister used to say that I was one of those that was born in the pew, because from the very first time that my mom could take me, she did. And we, growing up, went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. So it was an important part of our life. I graduated from Brentwood High School. Probably almost all my activities were centered around sports. Lettered in 4 sports: basketball, baseball, golf, and football. Because of the record that I have, I was awarded a full 4-year basketball scholarship, and I'll get into that in a little bit. I guess like most all kids, I enjoyed high school, enjoyed my time in Brentwood, and felt very, very fortunate that I had the athletic ability to be able to further playing and to go on to college and play. I had 12, 15 offers to play basketball from all different sizes and schools to major colleges. And it was at that time when I decided that maybe it was a time to break the strings a little bit and get a little further from home. So I really wanted to go outside of the state of Missouri, or further than that, to play basketball if I could. So I chose the offer at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. TCU had a wonderful campus. It was in a nice part of town in Fort Worth. Had a great reputation. Everybody I talked to said, you know, you really can't go wrong by going to school there. And probably was one of the highlights of my life that I was able to go there for 4 years, play basketball there for 4 years, and grow up in that atmosphere of a wonderful, small college, but still get a great education. I'd like to say at no cost, but it didn't cost me anything out of the checkbook, but it cost me that every day from 12 o'clock to 5 o'clock I had to go run the stadium stairs or do something that didn't get a lot of time off. Yeah. While I was there, my freshman year, I decided that I wanted to go into ROTC. So I signed up for the ROTC program. I was actually standing in line to sign up for Air Force ROTC because all my life I'd had this dream of flying and wanting to be able to fly. So my reasoning is that I would get into Air Force ROTC and be a pilot. And my very first registration, I was standing in line to sign up for Air Force ROTC, and one of the senior basketball players came by and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm signing up for ROTC, Air Force." He said, "Well, I can see that, but why are you signing up for Air Force?" I said, "Well, I want to fly." He says, "Do you know that the Army has more pilots than the Air Force does?" And he briefly explained, of course, later on I found out it was the exact same, but he briefly explained the Army flight program through ROTC. So what that meant is in my senior year of ROTC, I was able to get my private pilot's license, was able to get ground school, and learn how to fly while I was in college. That obligated me for extra service, so I had a 3-year commitment instead of a 2-year commitment because they felt like they had spent that money on me and wanted to get their money's worth. So that obligated me to go to flight school when I got out and got commissioned when I graduated. Okay. I really enjoyed ROTC. I was really glad that they talked to me as Army instead of Air Force. Again, I at that time thought I would make flying a career, and it seemed like it would be a lot quicker to get on those steps if I had a 3-year commitment in the Army instead of a 6-year commitment in the Air Force. Yeah, okay. My mom and dad were real pleased that I signed up for ROTC and that I would become an officer. My dad was a civilian employee with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in St. Louis, and my mom was executive director of the credit union at that office. And so both of them had, even though there was no military service, history of military service, both of them were very, very proud that in their day-to-day contact with the officers and the Army personnel there that I had decided that I was going to go in and be an officer. Got commissioned and graduated on the same day as a second lieutenant. That was in May of 1967. And I had a couple of months till my reporting duty. I had orders to report to Fort Eustis, Virginia. And I didn't have to report till the 10th of July. So I had a great time. Went with a fraternity brother, and he was living in California, so I drove home with him and stopped in Las Vegas for the first trip and first time there, and went home with him into Southern California and spent a week with him, and went up into the Bay Area and the wine country area for a couple of weeks before I came home and started to get myself ready to go to Fort Eustis.
How much did you know about what was going on in Vietnam at the time?
Well, you know, obviously it was on the news every day and every night. And there was a lot of concern about people who were going to get drafted, or if they didn't make their grades in college, they could get drafted. I think it was during my time in college where they said you could not be eligible for the draft if you got married. And I know there were 4 or 5 guys that I knew at TCU who went and moved their wedding day up a year or two just so that they could meet that requirement of not getting drafted. I figured that I would be going to Vietnam. Of course, in the early days of school, you think, well, this thing's going to be over by then. We wouldn't have to worry about it. And but all of that was really overwhelmed in my mind because of my wanting to be able to fly. Now, the Army had told me that because I had a fixed-wing private license and because I was fixed-wing qualified, that would almost guarantee me that I would go to airplanes in the Army and not go to rotor school. But my orders to flight training were to report to rotor school, and their answer was, we need rotor wing pilots a lot more than we need fixed wing pilots right now.
Tell us about your training, where you were, what you were being trained to do specifically, any experiences that stand out in your mind?
My first duty reporting station was Fort Eustis, Virginia, and that was because I was a transportation officer in the Transportation Corps. And the Army said you have to learn how to be a transportation officer before you go to flight school or anything else. So that course of training at Fort Eustis was, I think, about 8 weeks, 9 weeks, maybe something like that. And I learned all the things about the Transportation Corps, which just was not helicopters, but trains and trucks and boats and every other method of transportation that the Army had. Then it was, the good side of that is while I was at Fort Eustis, I lived in Colonial Williamsburg and developed a real love for that part of the country and that area. I still think Colonial Williamsburg is one of the best places to visit in the United States. But after that training was over, I was just very impatiently waiting to get my orders to go to flight school. And I felt like I knew that they would come at any day. But of course the Army won't let you just do nothing for a week or 2 weeks. So they had to assign me to a unit. And they signed me to a unit on the only Army working railroad in the United States. In the world, I guess, when you got to at that time. And so I was a brand new second lieutenant, and I was assigned the job of platoon leader of the diesel locomotive engine repair shop. And you can imagine how I really got into that job. But you know, here I was a brand new second lieutenant, and there were 4 or 5 E6, E7 guys down there who had grease up to their elbows every day, and they didn't care, you know, who I was or what I was as much as I cared about learning about diesel engine locomotive repair. But an interesting side to that is later on, when my kids were little, they all thought it was more exciting that I drove a train than I drove helicopters. So that has since changed their mind as they've gotten older. But when they were little, they thought, "Oh, my dad drove a train." That was
Well, that does raise the question: what did you do when you had that position?
it was a typical platoon leader's job of managing those guys and directing those guys. And obviously, I didn't know any of the technical, and I didn't try to fool them that I did. But you know, we still had Army things to do as far as getting ready for inspections. But their main job was to get the diesel engines into the roundhouse and get them repaired, even if it was just like maintenance on a truck or something, where you had to change the oil and lubricate and grease and keep keep them running. The Army maintained this in case there ever was a situation where there was another war or another conflict where we needed trains, that they would have the expertise and the ability to move them there. Or even in the United States, the ability to move a large group of people from one fort to another fort, or one location, one coast to another coast, having that ability to do it by rail was important.
Okay.
So it was kind of fun. Again, I only had that for like 4 weeks before my orders came in from flight school. And as it turned out, two of the guys that I were living with in Williamsburg, all three of us got our orders to flight school in the same class. So we all packed up and drove to Fort Walters in Mineral Wells, Texas, which was the primary helicopter school for the entire Army. They were known as much for their warrant officer candidate program there as they were for their RLOs, or real live officer program. Of course, again, there the biggest advantage as officers is we got to live off post, and after our training for flight was over, we could go home, and the warrant officer candidates would have to go back to the barracks and shine shoes and do all that as the equivalent of going through OCS. But of course, we were already commissioned officers and didn't have to do that. Actually, the training for me at Fort Walters was a real kick, because not only was I getting to fly, which I didn't have any inherent problems with the fear of flying or the fear of doing that, or with navigation or with weather or anything like that, because I knew how to do that from my private pilot's license. It was just learning how to fly a helicopter is what it amounted to. And of course, the biggest thing is that school was primarily for us Monday through Fridays, and we had Saturday and Sundays off. And having graduated from TCU, which was only 50 miles down the road, it was like me being back in school again, and was able to continue to find a lot of young ladies who, you know, and in college, a big date was a 6-pack of beer and go to the drive-in. Well, we came back and we were all on TDY pay, and we were making a lot of money, and we probably knew where we were going. Yeah. So I always had about 5 or 6 girls that'd say, "Fix me up with some of your friends." Yeah. And of course, we'd go over and want to eat steaks and dance. And so that was a real kick to be able to go back and do that. Graduated from that and went to advanced helicopter training. Interestingly enough, all advanced training up to that time was done at Fort Rucker in Alabama. And because the classes were so large and coming through so often, they needed another place to train. And the Army opened up Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah as another training facility for advanced helicopter training. So they came to our officer company at Fort Walters and said, "You all are going to be very fortunate. We're going to have the ability to have the first class to go to Hunter Army Airfield. Now, the problem is we only need 25 people to go." And I guess there was maybe 70 or 80 in our class. And said, so very untypical Army, they said, "We'll ask for volunteers, and if there's not 25, well then we'll take the ones who ask and we'll assign the rest. If there's more than 25, then we'll just draw names to see who the 25 are going to be." Well, me and my other 2 roommates all decided we had heard of Savannah, Georgia before, but we'd not ever heard of Dothan, Alabama, or Enterprise, Alabama, or even that much about Fort Rucker. So all 3 of us put our names in. They had more than 25, so they had to draw, but my one roommate and I got Hunter Army Airfield. The other one had to go to Fort Rucker, and he cussed us, I think, for the next 6 or 8 weeks about the life in Dothan, Alabama. Flight training at Hunter Army Airfield was absolutely the best there was. It was a great location. My friend and I lived on the beach, Tybee Island. Again, we were on TDY, so we were making tons of money, and we knew where we were going. So we'd come home on Friday night, put on a swimming suit, and stay that way till Sunday night. It was a great duty assignment, but great flying. We did all of our advanced training in Hueys there, learned how to really fly tactically, and we had the last 2 weeks of your training, you actually went out into the field, and we went to Fort Stewart, where we actually did mission flying and actually what we'd be doing in Vietnam. So great training. When I graduated from there, they took the top graduates. I was actually kind of ready to think that I was going to go to Vietnam right away. And they said, well, the top of the class graduates we're going to send on to advanced training. And because of my experience in the Transportation Corps and being in the Transportation Corps, they sent me back to Fort Eustis to take a maintenance and test pilot course, which would then qualify me to make recoveries of aircraft and to test pilot an aircraft. Anytime a helicopter was fixed, that it was damaged, or anything had happened to it, and it required component replacement, like bullet holes in wings required a new wings, rotor, anything that had to, engine change, anything that had to be done, somebody had to test fly that helicopter and then sign off in the logbook that it was safe for training or flying and that everybody else could use it on a mission then. So this was a school that was designed to do that. And again, that gave me about 8 more weeks in the States, and I mean, it's getting to this point after you spend all this time flying and all this time learning the mission, you're ready to go. And there was always this thought, well, you know, there's talk about the war will be over, you know, you never know, of course. Got my orders for Vietnam.
Now,
And,
when was this, when you got your orders, approximately?
Probably August of 68.
Okay.
1968. So, like everybody, I took some leave and went home and visited the parents and made the arrangements that everybody needs to make as far as cars and banks and money and all of that kind of thing. I was single, so I didn't have quite as, I guess, much to do as everybody else, or as married people were getting ready to go. And my orders were report to Travis Air Force Base outside of San Francisco for departure for overseas on 11 November of 1968, which happens to be Veterans Day. So I went on Veterans Day and came home on Veterans Day.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was pretty nervous about all of this, but I think the nerves had to do more with the unknown than it was being scared. I felt very comfortable in my flying ability, in how to fly and knowing where to fly and where to go. So I felt like I had a little one-upsmanship, if you can say, about, I knew that I was going to be okay, that I didn't have any doubt as to my ability of what to do or any doubt about what that helicopter could do. So I felt very comfortable with that. It's, the uncomfortableness came from the unknown. You know, here's this little country halfway across the world. You'd see it on the news every night. Usually you saw a helicopter get crashed or getting shot at or burning. You know, as I told my parents, it's probably the same helicopter that they showed the clip over and over and over again, but of course they didn't know that. But, so I flew to San Francisco. I had to spend the night in San Francisco because of the way you had to report at Travis. you couldn't go out there and then report at the time in Travis at the same time and be able to make it. So they said my report time was 1 o'clock. No, I think my report time was 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock in the morning. So I had to come in the night before, take the bus from San Francisco up to Travis Air Force Base. And of course I went in to report, and the first thing they said is, well, be back at 4 o'clock. So, you know, from 11 to 4, they said, here's the officers club, and if you want to go get a sandwich or whatever. So, you know, it was, I guess, indoctrinating me to the true Army way of hurry up and wait, and we'll get to you. So we didn't actually, and it came back at 4, and it was like, you know, be back at 6. And I think we finally departed Travis Air Force Base on a Braniff Airlines charter, and we departed at about 7:30 at night, because it was very significant. As we took off from Travis, we flew over San Francisco Bay and right over the Golden Gate Bridge and departed into the sunset. And I told myself right then, I said, you're going to see that again. You're coming home, no matter what they say. You're going to come home and see that again. Of course, the flight, it's a long way from San Francisco to Tonsanut. So the good news is our first refueling stop was Honolulu. And we landed at the commercial field, and they said, you've got 3 hours to, while we turn this airplane around and get it cleaned and get it stocked and for the flight. So you've got 3 hours that you can get out and stretch. So, of course, almost all of us went to the bar. There weren't the restrictions on the traveling like there are now, that you can't drink or anything like that. And got back on the plane and had an all-night flight to the Philippines, Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, where they did not let us get off. They said, you know, we've got everything we need but gas. So they refueled. And that was pretty early in the morning, if I remember. Maybe 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., still dark. And then we flew from Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines to Tonsanut and landed at Tonsanut. My first impression was the heat. They didn't have jetways or anything like that, and they opened that door to walk off, and even at 10 o'clock in the morning, the heat was stifling right down that day. Yeah. And I guess being, you know, 22 hours in an air-conditioned airplane didn't help. But and I also, I think, I was kind of surprised that everybody was just doing their business. You know, people were fueling the plane, and people were driving trucks, and people were carrying supplies, and you could see people out walking around, and I guess maybe that wasn't my first vision of what I thought the war was going to be like at Tonsanut, which, of course, it wasn't a lot of other places. Yeah. But, and, of course, all the people that were working on the line and everything got a great kick of saying, oh, here all the FNGs are here, and catcalling and giving us names, and I guess the universal thing while you're in Vietnam is they'd all say, I'm short, to let us know that they'd be going home before we would. And it was then, I guess, we learned the concept of counting each day and marking each day off, you know, as you hope for that day when you could go home. So after landing at Tonsanut, I went over to the replacement company, and they said, you're assigned to the 17th Combat Aviation Group, and you can go over there to the I'm going to say personnel, where they assign you replacement company. Yeah. So you go over there to the replacement company report. So we finally got over to that part, and it was 2 days of waiting till they found out where they wanted to send us. So here we are in Vietnam, and hauling all of our bags around, you know, our duffel bag and everything else. They put us up in the BOQ and told you where the PX was, and they told you where the officers club were, and it seemed like they forgot about you, you know, because you had 2 or 3 days to do nothing. So then finally the orders came down for me to say that I was going to be assigned to the next level down, which was the 10th Combat Aviation Battalion. And they were headquartered in Dong Batin, which was right across the bay from Cameron Bay. So went to Dong Batin and signed in to the replacement company there, and went in and got a briefing from the battalion commander on the different companies that flew for the 10th Battalion and where each one was and what they would be doing. And he said, so, you know, we're going to take this group of 8 of you, or how many ever there were, and decide which your needs can be best be met, and we'll assign you to one of these companies. And of course, in the BOQ there, they had every one of these companies listed on the wall and the battles that they had been in and what they'd done, which immediately gave us, ooh, I don't want to go to that one, or ooh, I want to go to this one, or, you know, not that it made any difference, but it gave us an opportunity to do that. And I got called in, and the replacement guy said, well, I see you've been to test pilot school, and we have a need for a test pilot. However, we have an individual who is what we consider one of the best maintenance officer and test pilots that we have. And he's gotten all kinds of write-ups and all kinds of good information on him. And I think I'm going to send you TDY for a week with him to learn his secrets on maintaining and scheduling and repair and replacement and test flying before I send you to a company. And the company I'm going to send you to is the 281st Assault Helicopter Company in the Trang, but I want you to go on up to this other place for a week TDY. So again, here I am still hauling my duffel bag and my pack and suitcase and all of my stuff, and went up to
What was the company?
281st Assault Helicopter Company, and they were stationed in the Trang. So I went TDY for 5 days to try and learn how to do it this guy's way, which they considered was one of the best in the Army. And he was good. He had a great maintenance record. He had a unique plan of scheduling. He had a unique plan of how to maintain helicopters, how to keep them flying, because it's just like anything. A helicopter in maintenance shed isn't any good. And they're just like cars or trucks or anything else. They fly so many hours, and they have to have a oil change and maintenance and all of those kinds of things. And again, when a major component is changed, it has to have a test flight. So I did get some good insight from him. And then after my time was up, reported to the 281st Assault Helicopter Company. Our mission, and our primary mission, was support of the 5th Special Forces, which were the Green Berets. Very unique mission in what the Green Berets had and to do. We primarily worked 2 projects for them. One of them was called Recondo, and the other one was called Project Delta. And we did all of the flying for those 2 projects. Sometimes they didn't have a requirement because of the stand down, and then we would go out and fly other missions for other support, just because we had the helicopters and they didn't want to leave them sitting on the ground. And those involved everything that the helicopters did in Vietnam, those missions. You know, you're aware that the roads were bad in Vietnam. There was no railroad at all. The bridges were bad. It's hard getting POL all the time. So the helicopter became the mainstay of how you got around.
What type of aircraft were you flying? What type of helicopter?
We had UH-1Hs for the slicks, which was the primary helicopter used in Vietnam. And the gunships, we had one platoon of gunships and 2 platoons of slicks. And the gunships we used were UH-1C model Charlie models. I'll get onto the helicopters and then let me get back to the mission. So if we weren't flying a Delta mission, either Recondo or we'd be flying these other things. And it involved people, involved mail, involved supplies, involved water, involved Agent Orange, would involve anything else that the command deemed that they needed a helicopter for this group and you were to go out and fly that day for them. The uniqueness of that is we got a lot of experience flying because you did a lot of things. You might be supporting the Koreans on a mission up in the mountains and spend a day sling loading 55 drums of water to them, 55-gallon drums of water to them. You may be supporting the Red Cross and you'd fly Red Cross donut dollies around to 4 or 5 bases where they could go and spend a couple hours with the troops out that were really out in the boonies. It may involve hauling mail, food, supplies, would be an ambulance, either for wounded or even recovery of the body bags, depending upon the exact mission of it. But our primary focus in our flying was the support of the 5th Special Forces Group. Recondo was a mission that the Green Berets had in training and teaching a exclusive escape and evasion courses for Vietnam, primarily designed for elite type forces. So all of the Green Berets would go through it. Navy SEALs sometime would come up and go through it. Air Force Rangers. Anybody that their units felt like they wanted to go to this elite school, they'd send them down to Nha Trang to go through this course. The course was held on Antri Island, which was off the Bay of Nha Trang, and an island which the 5th Special Forces controlled, and they had that set up for all their training exercises.
Can you spell that, Jim? Do you know how to spell it?
Antri Island?
Yeah.
I'm not real sure. I think it's like Hointrey, maybe.
Okay.
It may be Entree.
That's good.
It's off the coast from Nha Trang. And of course it was a wonderful opportunity for the 281st to train too with our new pilots. So we would take a team over there, insert that team. They would be given a mission over there. They were told that there's a lot of enemy in the area. They were to avoid detection. And they spent a lot of time with them over there, teaching them escape and evasions. Obviously every one of them got captured at some point in time on the island, got put in bamboo cages, got interrogated. I mean, as close as they could make it to the real thing. Helicopter pilots didn't have to do that, but to some extent we caught it as we would take a team in and let a team out. And it gave our pilots a good time for training too. So that was one of their missions. And their other mission was Project Delta. And this is where we spent most of our time and what we're doing. Project Delta, unlike a lot of combat forces in Vietnam, most of the time we're not interested in finding the enemy to make contact with them. Most all of their missions that came down were what we called a sneaky Pete mission. They wanted to get put in the field somewhere, a significant point, a significant river, a significant part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and in almost all cases they did not want to get found out. They did not want to get seen or heard from, and definitely didn't want to get into contact with the enemy. There were some exceptions to that. I remember one time we had a mission of a prisoner snatch where they wanted to capture a North Vietnamese officer, and they went in, and in that particular case, you know, they had to get very close to the enemy, and in their sneaky Pete ways of sneaking up, and you know, they never walked trails, and would get close enough to recognize an officer when they came down the trail and snatch him and get him back. But most of the time they were not interested in making contact with the enemy. Unfortunately, a lot of times it did. We would set them in, and their mission would be recon of a river, but they did an awful lot of the Ho Chi Minh Trail stuff. And they would do a lot of things before we would send the Cav or the 101st in or something like that, where they would go and kind of map the area of what it was like and what the terrain was like and everything like that. So there were times when they got put into very heavily infested areas and had to really maintain a real low profile till we could come and get them out, or and obviously there were times when they got shot up and all of that too, and we still had to go get them. Because they had this mission of being sneaky Pete, it required some unique flying on our part. And by the way, we were recognized by the Army as being the first special ops helicopter company in the Army. So like any of the other missions that you see now that are special ops, we were recognized as being the first to develop the flying and the techniques for putting these teams in. Typically, a team would be 5 helicopters that would head out. One of the helicopters would be command and control, so that would be where the air commander and the ground commander were on that helicopter, and usually flew the front ship in a V of 5 ships. And then we had 2 helicopters for insertion, where a team or the teams would be on those helicopters. And we had 2 helicopters for recovery in case something happened or as backup or whatever. I think it was interesting in the news lately, we've heard about SEAL Team 6 and they're going in on their mission, and that they had 2 helicopters. They had one that was a primary helicopter and one as a backup or recovery helicopter. And I heard one station that says this was the first time they've ever done this. Well, you know, we were having recovery helicopters on our mission 40 years ago, so sure. I just thought that was an interesting side. I think that I have some pictures and would like to get into more of our mission on Delta and how we did it and what we did, but maybe this would be a good time to take a break.
Sure. Good. That's really good.
How we doing?
Good.
You're flowing through. That's.
I want to talk to you a little bit, or tell a little bit about a typical mission that we flew with Project Delta and a typical event. When we went in Delta, we moved out in a train and we moved into FOB, a forward operating base, somewhere out in the country, which would be close enough to an area of operation that the mission would be for them. And we would start from scratch and build a camp with the help of the Special Forces. And then we would live in tents, crew tents, sandbagged with revetments for our helicopters, and it was a different style for us from our living in the train. I have one mission that I'll tell about to what it is, and this is a picture of our mission into Mylock Plantation. And this picture is significant in the fact that in the background you can see the village of Mylock. In the middle of the picture is the round Special Forces camp that was there. And then on the bottom is the airstrip and the area that we built in for the helicopters. This is unique in the fact that this was included the 5th Special Forces mission, because this was an A team that lived out in this plantation, and they were the team of 6 or 7 that were there to relate to the civilians, to help them in any way they could. They had one of their people was first aid, so they'd have somebody with first aid, they'd have somebody to help build a well, they'd have ability to help take care of their animals, and of course ability to teach these people in the village of Mylock up in the mountains on how to defend themselves if they wanted to. So this was a unique mission that I'm going to talk about, because Mylock is, you can see all of the events here. Another significant thing about Mylock is that geography-wise, it's about halfway between Dong Tao and Khe Sanh. So Dong Tao is one of the most northern bases. It was a Marine base, and one of the most northern bases in South Vietnam. It was on the water. And Khe Sanh was the famous Marine base that was in the mountains. And Mylock Plantation is about halfway between Dong Tao and Khe Sanh. So we would move in and we'd set up operations from there, and then we would fly according to what the mission was of that Project Delta at that time. Normally, we would fly 5 slick helicopters. The first helicopter would be command and control, and that's where the aircraft commander, or the commander of all the aircraft, and the ground commander of the 5th Special Forces would fly in that helicopter to be able to make any decisions or anything they had to make on that mission. And then there were 2 other slick helicopters, which were insertion helicopters. If we only had one insertion helicopter, the other would fly sometimes along as a decoy, and that maybe when we'd go to put the team in, we'd drop one helicopter off and it'd fly down and land in an LZ like it was dropping somebody off, but really not do it, as a deception to any NVA in the jungle or anything that had heard it would think that maybe or maybe not a team was getting dropped off. And again, I think we had 2 recovery ships that were obviously along in case there was any trouble, maintenance, or enemy contact wise or whatever, where we would need to have a recovery ship. I have a second picture of the team that is leaving now to go out on a Delta mission. And you'll see the 5 helicopters on this. They're in our typical V formation. Command and control would be the first helicopter. The first and second one on the left would be what we call the hole helicopters, helicopters that go down in the hole. And the 2 on the right would be recovery helicopters. We were escorted on the entire mission by our 3rd platoon, which was the Wolf Pack, which was guns. And they usually would take a heavy fire team, which would mean 3 C models to support us if the team got in any trouble on the insertion or anything on enemy activity, we had our own gun teams on site with us as we put the team in. We put in several different types of teams. This is a picture of a team that we put in, which is all South Vietnamese Rangers. So this did not have any Americans on the team. Part of the Delta mission was to train the South Vietnamese Rangers in operations and how they did it. So this is a picture of a team. They're on the ground and they're getting prepared to go to the helicopters and get in. And of course, we put typical American team. I think this is actually a team of 4, which are 2 American and 2 South Vietnamese Rangers. And it depended upon the mission and the type of mission of what they were going in to the area for. Whether it be a prisoner snatch, whether it be mapping, whether it would be monitoring the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or whether it would be listening or setting up listening devices, or whatever their particular mission might be, would depend upon how the team was selected and what people went on that team with what skills. Once in a while, we would put in, if the team ran into some trouble, or if there was bomb strike or air strike that we needed to go in and see the results of that, we would put in the Vietnamese Ranger Company. And this just shows you a complete Ranger company that we would put in on specific missions again. Very unique to notice in this picture that how well equipped they are. They all have U.S. equipment, how well trained they are, and just as a side, how young they all look. But this was the South Vietnamese elite fighting force that we would put in. And then they would load onto the helicopters. Here you see a helicopter with probably 8 Rangers in it, and you'll notice the rope ladders. We had, if we got into an area in the landing zone which we could not land and touch down or even get to within a 3-foot hover, we'd unhook the rope ladders and they'd go down the ladders to get into the site. When we put a team into a whole ship, this is a very, very typical site that on a mission that we would do. And from just about anybody else, it looks like just a picture of the trees. But if you look right into the center of the picture, you'll see the LZ, which is a small clearing in the jungle, and there is actually a helicopter down in that LZ deploying a team at that time. This was the mission that we used most of the time. And then the team would move from there, move through the area operations, set up a point to where they'd want to be. And usually we would come to retrieve them 5 to 7 days later. They were usually in the bush that long. And it would never be from the same LZ. They would get to an area where they thought we could get a helicopter into to land and hopefully go undetected. Curiously enough, a lot of times when we were flying over to locate the team, one of the most effective ways of communicating with on the ground was mirrors, because they didn't have to worry about popping smoke or even talking for communications. They all wanted to talk as little as they could on the radio, and the old joke is, no, I'm not whispering because Charlie's here, I've got a hoarse throat. You know, because they always talked in a whisper. And the mirrors, which they would flash through the sun, you know, most of the time it was sunny, were an excellent way of recognizing exactly where they were. Especially on a sunny day if there were a team of 4 and they had gotten split up, and 2 of them went to one area and 2 of them went to another, so we had to make, that's when we'd use both helicopters to go in and get them. So we went in to get them, whether they were hurt, whether it was safe, whether there were bad guys or whatever. Our mission was to always get the team out, and we did that with any possible thing we had. When the 5th Special Forces, when Project Delta was on a mission, they had the Air Force at their call, whether that meant they needed napalm or whether they needed bombing run. They usually, because of the high level of their mission, was able to get whatever they want. But most of the time, we in the 281st felt like it was our job. We put them in to get them out, and we would get them out regardless. One of the ways that we did that, if the team was injured in some ways or damaged, was we used a thing called a Mcguire Rig. It was invented by Sergeant Major Mcguire and the Green Berets, and it evolved a sling and a way to put the soldiers in the sling, and the helicopter did not have to land to do that. It had a penetrator so it could go down between the trees. Again, the key was getting as close as we could to the soldiers so that they could get onto the sling, and then we would pull them up, and they would get a nice cool ride back to the first safest place where we could sit down and take them off the rigs. Here's a picture of 3 Green Berets that 2 of them were shot pretty bad. One was real bad, and this was, they had to use Mcguire rigs to get them out. And this is them as they're coming into our FOB, our Forward Operating Base, to get home. And just a little closer picture of it where you can see them a little bit better. Most of the time, as I said, their mission was sneaky Pete, and they did not want to get caught or found out. When we were finished and their mission was finished, it was time to go home and go back to Nha Trang. And everybody was excited. I don't know who was excited more, whether it was the pilots or whether it was the Project Delta people. But the customary thing that we did when everything was over is we had a flyby over the operating base camp where the crew chiefs tied smoke onto the bottom of the skids. And you'll see here the 5 of the helicopters, which were the typical 5 that we used on the mission, flying over with smoke tied onto each skid. So it was a good time for us to get back to Nha Trang and have a couple of days to relax before the next mission started. I have just one other quick story that I'd like to tell. One of the missions that we were on was putting a team in, and the LZ that they had selected was some sort of a little bomb crater in the middle of the jungle, and looked like it was going to be okay to get a helicopter in. I, being the senior man on this mission, was flying C&C and command and control, and I was the aircraft commander of the mission and was flying along with Major, who was the Green Beret ground commander. Jim Baker and John Korsbeck were friends of mine, obviously, and they were flying Whole Ship 1. So their job was to get the team inserted into the LZ and out as fast as they could. Well, as they went to land in the LZ, it was not a newly bombed LZ, and there was a bunch of scrub and brush laying loose in the LZ. And as Jim Baker flew the helicopter in, some of this brush got sucked up into the tail rotor, and he had a tail rotor strike of some pretty good size limbs. He did get the team off and got up back into the formation, and he said that he radioed me and said that he had a tail rotor warning light and was concerned. So I immediately sent him with an escort to go back to Vandergrift Marine Base, which was the closest base to where we were operating, and to check it out. So he flew immediately back to Vandergrift, and we completed the mission. And since one of my jobs was recovery officer, I thought, well, I'll just go to Vandergrift too and check out what the damage is, because if it has to be recovered, I'm going to have to be the one to come out here and get it anyway. So we landed the command and control helicopter at Vandergrift, and Jim was up looking at the tail rotor but couldn't see anything. So I said, well, let me look at it. So we shut the command and control helicopter down. So now there were 2 helicopters on the pad at Vandergrift shut down, which Charlie used that as a good excuse to take target practice and try and get helicopters. So I was standing up on the Stinger, or the Huey, shaking the tail rotor to see if it was okay or not, and the mortars and rockets started coming in. So I jumped down and I told the Peter pilot, who's the assistant to Jim, John Korsbeck, I said, you go get in command and control and you fly that back with the other pilot in there and get out of here. And I looked over at Jim Baker and I said, I'll fly this back if you'll go with me. And he said, I'll go with you. So we got it started up without getting a hit from the mortars or the rockets. And it seemed to be okay. Went through pre-flight checks okay. Went through a ground hover test okay. And I said, I'll fly it back. The warning light was on, and about halfway through the flight back to our FOB at Mylock, we got some other warning lights, and I was beginning to wonder if I made a very good decision. And on the way down onto the approach to land at Mylock Plantation, the tail rotor fell off. And I went ahead and made a safe landing by using a procedure of how to land without a tail rotor. And this is a picture they took afterwards. So it was just a real case of being in the right place at the right time and able to get the helicopter down even though it was damaged.
But it was also having the training and the skill to do it, right?
An interesting story on this is that Jim Baker and I keep up, and we are in contact all the time. John Korsbeck I had not heard from, who was the Peter pilot to Jim Baker, had not heard from in probably 30 years. And he saw my name where I had signed into a web page one time, and he called the house. And I wasn't there, but my wife Marilyn was there. And Korsbeck proceeded to talk to her and tell her stories about this situation and how I had saved his life because I sent him back on the first helicopter instead of staying there and have to fly this damaged one back. So he told Marilyn about what a big hero I was and how great I was, and I saved his life in Vietnam. Well, I got home and Marilyn said, hey, I had an interesting call from John Korsbeck. And I said, who's that? She said, it was a guy you flew with in Vietnam, and he said you saved his life. Well, then after she repeated the story, of course, I knew who it was, and we had a wonderful relationship with John for a couple years before he died 3 years ago with, in relation to Agent Orange.
Okay.
So the best part is, after we finished Delta and the mission was accomplished, was to fly back to Nha Trang and have an opportunity to get a little rest and relaxation. Even though we continued to fly missions, it was not anywhere near the strenuous or the what was involved with trying to put a team in and keeping a team in. A lot of energy and nerves that were spent when those teams were out, especially when they were very close to contact and what was going on. Mm-hmm. There were even times when we kept a crew member sleeping in the helicopter so that if we needed to get cranked up real quick to go out there. So when we got back to Nha Trang, we were very happy. We We had a wonderful place to stay at Nha Trang. We had a really good BOQ. We had something that everybody wanted there, and that was helicopters. So we could usually trade a helicopter ride for a case of steaks or a case of chicken or pork chop, and we did some cooking out on the patio. We had a wonderful PX. We had a movie theater, and we decided when we were there we had our own projector, and so the 5th Special Forces, when they got finished watching the movies, they'd give it to us, and we'd go over in my room and we'd have a matinee, and people who weren't flying and watch the matinee. So we did enjoy our time in Nha Trang, partially because, you know, that's the way the war is. You had breakfast with a pilot every morning, and you didn't know whether you'd see that pilot again for dinner. So it was one of those things you didn't talk about, but everybody felt like their main goal was not to let their buddies down, and that we got the team in, we'll get them out. So when we got back to where we could enjoy a little bit, we did, and took some of that pressure and strenuous thoughts out. While I was in Vietnam, I was very fortunate to go on an R&R. I took my R&R to Sydney, Australia. Obviously I had never been in that part of the world. It was a unique experience to visit Sydney, to see some of the culture, to see some of the eating and drinking establishments, and to meet some of the local people. It was a great opportunity that the government gave for us to have that week on R&R. Also, in the situation I was in, the company commander allowed me to take 5 days of leave, and I had plenty of leave accumulated to go to Hong Kong. So I went to Hong Kong for 5 days and took advantage of some wonderful food and some wonderful shopping. They had a tailor where you could go in and you'd stand up on a piece of paper, and he would draw an outline around your foot and take a couple of measurements, and 2 days later you'd go in and have handmade pair of shoes. So while I was there, I had 2 pair of golf shoes and 3 pair of alligator shoes made. And I think the alligator shoes at that time were maybe $10 each or $15 each, and 3 for $30 or something like that. And interestingly enough, each one of my boys now has a pair of those alligator shoes. They have held up well and obviously last well.
Wow.
When it was time to leave, my year of duty was up. I got in country on the 11th of November of '68, and I left on the 11th of November of '69. I flew out of Cam Ranh Bay, since we were in Nha Trang, and that's just a very, very short distance down to Cam Ranh Bay. I flew on a World Airlines charter coming home. It was hot, and you're standing out the deck, and obviously on the tarmac they don't want the airplane to stay very long on the ground. It doesn't even refuel. They really just come in and throw the bags off, throw the bags on, unload the troops that are coming in, and throw you on, get you on as quick as you can to go. And of course you're very anxious to get on that plane and go. And you go up the steps to World Airlines plane, and a beautiful young stewardess is up there, and they knew what they were doing. They handed everybody a dish of ice cream as you got on, and then came up and down the aisles with big pitchers of ice water, and took off relatively quick. We flew from Cam Ranh Bay to Japan, stopped in Japan and refueled and crew changed, and then we flew from there to McCord Air Force Base in Seattle. And it was real interesting as we came down through the clouds to land. I was immediately aware of there were streets that were paved, that there were cars going up and down those streets. And of course, it was a holiday. And of course, in Seattle, it was raining and misting. But it sure was a good feeling to be back. We had to get from McCord Air Force Base up to Seattle, the SeaTac Airport, to catch a flight to go home. My home of record at that time was St. Louis, where my parents lived. So I had to catch a flight from Seattle to St. Louis. And I got on that flight, and it was Veterans Day, and had wonderful conversation with a flight attendant as I was going back. She wanted to hear all about it, and even though she flew out and out of Seattle, she said she didn't get that many military, but was very receptive and very friendly in talking to me. When I believe that was an Eastern Airlines flight that I was on. As Eastern was getting ready to approach St. Louis, the pilot came on and said we were going to have to hold for a while. Being Veterans Day, there is a veterans cemetery right on the end of the St. Louis runway, and an Air Force officer was being put to rest in that cemetery that day. And the Air Force he was a pilot, the Air Force was going to do their flyover, missing man flyover, to honor that pilot that had been killed in Vietnam. And to fly over that cemetery, it went right over the airport, so they had to close the airport down to do this flyover. And so we had to hold for a little bit, then we got to land, and I got off the plane expecting to have a big welcome and see my mom and dad, and my mom and dad weren't there. So I walked down to the baggage claim, got my bags, and still didn't see my mom and dad. Well, I was kind of walking around deciding what to do, and in come my dad and mom running, and my mom was giving my dad all kinds of static about we didn't leave in time and didn't do it. But of course, what happened is, as they were having this flyover of the cemetery, they also had some roads that were closed, so they couldn't get there as early as they wanted. But did have a good meal at home and stayed at home for a couple of weeks, and reported to my last duty station, which was Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I had 6 months to fill of my obligation, and tried to get out early. They wouldn't let me out early. They tried to get me to wanted to know if I'd want to re-enlist in the Army in aviation, and I said that I was a fixed-wing pilot, and I was thinking about a career in aviation, and if they could send me to fixed-wing transition, I would stay in. And the colonel that I was talking to came back the next day and said, Captain Torbert, the only thing I can guarantee you is that if you sign up to stay in 6 months you'll be back for a second tour in Vietnam, and then we'll see about fixed-wing transition. So I made that decision that I would see him later, and saluted and got out of the Army, July of '70.
I want to ask you a question about one more experience in Vietnam and go back a little bit. Did you have the opportunity to deal with the civilians at all in the Trang, Vietnamese civilians?
Yes, we did. We had several opportunities. Number one is because we were stationed with the Green Berets, the 5th Special Forces, they did a lot to the local economy and to try and support the local economy and to support the local people. So in the dining hall in the officers club where we ate in the dining, all of the waitresses, all of the busboys and all were local civilians. Our hooch Where we lived in the BOQ was we hired what we called hooch maids. They are basically young ladies who would take care of our rooms in the BOQ. By taking care of rooms, it meant that they couldn't spit shine our shoes, but they could knock the dust off of them. They could sweep out our rooms, and they would do a little bit of wash for us. We didn't have wash machines. We didn't have dryers. So being washes, they'd go swish it around in some dirty water and then hang it up on the line. But at least you got the feeling that it had been washed. And so had some contact with the local people in that respect. Because we were in Nha Trang, it did give us the opportunity to go downtown and to take part in the local activities. There was a restaurant in Nha Trang that a lot of our people frequented. I only went there once. It was called Marie's or Maria's. And I was all encompassed with this idea that I'm going home, and I didn't want to get sick or anything like that. So I figured the safest thing I could have would be a lobster, because they would boil it in the water, and at least I knew that it had gotten boiled in the water. No matter how the water was, at least it was boiling. So I had a lobster there, which was wonderful. But that was my one excursion into downtown Nha Trang. When we were on FOB to Delta, there is an interesting situation we had with dealing with the local economy and the local civilian populace. This was in mountain yard country, and so there were several mountain yard tribes that were very close to where we were setting up our camp. Well, they went out and negotiated with these tribes to come in and work for us for a short period of time. So in the morning, you would get up as the sun was coming up, and there would be all of these mountain yards out around the perimeter ready to go to work. And the ladies and the kids would come in the perimeter and would do very hard manual labor. Dig trenches, fill sandbags, fill revetments, very hard work. And the kids would be there standing right over them, watching him. And the men would all stay outside the gate, hunkered down and chewing their betel nut or their tobacco or whatever they called it, waiting for the women to come out. And typically we would pay them a very insignificant amount of money and give them some food. And they were ecstatic and happy as could be of working for that small amount of food. So that was the extent of that and what we did from flying with the Rangers and that kind of stuff.
Now, based on the information that you had submitted, you left the Army in July of 1970, is that correct?
That's correct.
And give us a brief description of what you did subsequent to leaving the Army.
Well, probably one of the greatest things I did, I've told about the three of us who were in flight school together and living together. One of the guys and I decided that if we didn't travel to Europe and go see some other sites on the other side of the world, we'd never get a chance to do it. So my good friend Ron Moore and I both got out of the Army on the same day, 10 July 1970, and he was at Fort Eustis, I was at Fort Bragg, drove up and picked him up, and we drove to New York City, put my car in storage, and we took off for Europe. And we spent 3 months in Europe, went to 14 countries, all without reservation, all just, and you know, at that time the civilians were letting their hair grow and mustaches grow, and we really unwound by having a great trip.
Good.
And we came back and decided that, you know, it's a great thing we did it, but now we need to go to work, and we would probably get married and all those other things. So most of my corporate life has been in sales. I retired 20 years from Nortel Networks, where I ran a national sales team in cellular and wireless division.
Well, you got an amazing story, very interesting, both militarily and non-militarily, and we really appreciate you coming in here and sharing it with us. And I want to do two things before we terminate the interview. Number one, Tony, do you have any questions?
No.
Well, let me put a plug in while we're doing it here. I probably didn't mention one of the most important parts, but I got married, have been married 47 years to Marilyn. I met her on a blind date. She was a flight attendant in St. Louis. And we have 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. 2 of the kids are married. My daughter is married and living in Athens, Georgia, and has 2 young sons. So we have 2 grandsons. And her and her husband are both school teachers. My middle son is married and lives here in Atlanta and has his own construction company. And the youngest son is, I don't know that I can say about to get married, but he hasn't popped the question yet, but everybody knows this is the one. And he lives here in Atlanta also. So have been very fortunate to have a wonderful family life.
Well, I know you're proud of them and they're proud of you. And I want to give you one more opportunity to just say anything you want to say, either for people who will be watching this in the immediate future or people who will watch it down through the years.
Well, I think the thing that I'd want to say is that this is probably the best way to get the story of Vietnam. Even now when we see movies in the theater, when we read books, I think you do not get the real story of the individuals who fought there, individuals who worked there, who spent time there, and the real true story of what happened and how it happened. So I think this whole process here is the best way to truly find out what happened in the war and what we did when we were there.
Well, and you participating in it makes it what it is, and I want to thank you once again, and I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you. Welcome home.
You too.